They summoned us to watch. That was the part the young ones never understood when I told this story afterward, in the years I had left to tell it. They thought we had been dragged to the sundered hall as the defeated, made to kneel while better creatures argued over our bones. It was simpler and crueler than that. We were not the defeated. We were the witnesses. The conquered had a protocol for everything, a clause for every humiliation, and the clause that governed that morning required that the dispossessed be present to see the division of what had been taken from them. So they sent the writ across the long dark to the place where they believed our last people still huddled. And the writ said, in the cold grammar of the conquered, that the human delegation was invited to attend the ratification of the partition accord, and that attendance was not optional. I was the one who read the writ aloud to the others. My voice was not as strong as it had been when I first came to this work, a young attaché with good knees and a fool's certainty that reason settled things. 15 years of exile will take the certainty out of a man and the strength out of his knees both, and leave behind only the habit of the work. I read the writ, and I folded it, and I said we would go. There was no debate. There never was with us, not anymore. We had learned a kind of quiet that the conquered mistook for defeat, and that was in fact the most dangerous thing in the galaxy, though they would not understand that until the morning I am telling you about. The sundered hall stands on a moon called Tessavain, a gray rock with no native life, chosen for the conclave precisely because no member species could claim it. The conquered liked things that belonged to no one. It made them feel that their authority came from above rather than from any one of their grasping member states, and it let them pretend, in the way that powerful bodies always pretend, that the place where they made their decisions was somehow neutral, somehow clean. There is no clean place. I learned that as a boy on a world I have not seen in 15 years and will not name, because the conquered wrote it out of its registers, and I have no wish to write it back in for them. We came down to Tessavain in a small craft, an old shuttle the delegation had kept running on patience and salvaged parts, and the conquered's traffic control routed us through the service approaches, away from the grand processional lanes where the blocs would arrive. That was deliberate. Everything about the morning was deliberate. They wanted us to come in by the back, through the cargo locks and the maintenance galleries, so that by the time we reached the gallery seats we would already feel like what they intended us to be. I watched the faces of my people as we walked those galleries, the recyclers humming behind the walls, the cold light, the long gray corridors built for machines rather than guests, and I saw that the trick was working. Myra had her jaw set hard. Old Benedek, who had been recording the delegation's proceedings since before the severance, kept his eyes down and his hands folded around the slim case he carried, and he did not speak. I will tell you about Benedek's case in time. It is the center of everything. But a man does not understand a center until he has walked the long way around it, and I had walked the long way around for 15 years before that morning, so you will forgive me if I take you the long way too. The gallery of the sundered hall sits above and behind the main floor, a curved shelf of hard seats set into the wall, and from it you look down across the whole of the chamber. I had not been inside in 15 years, and I confess that despite everything, despite all that the room had done to my people, it took my breath when I came up the last stair and saw it again. The hall is built under a single vast dome of glass, ribbed with pale metal, and through that dome the daylight of Tessavain's pale sun poured down in great soft shafts that pooled on the marble of the floor far below. The light fell on the curved tiers of seating that wrapped the chamber, tier upon tier rising toward us, each tier a band of a different color where the robes of a different block or species had gathered. The cyan glow of the holographic displays ran along the walls beneath the daylight, cool and constant, and where the two met, where the warm light from the dome touched the cold light from the machines, the air itself seemed to shimmer faintly, full of the slow drift of dust caught in the sun. It was beautiful. I want you to understand that it was beautiful, because the beauty was part of the cruelty. They had built a cathedral to their own judgment, and they had filled it with light, and they meant for us to feel small inside it, and small is exactly what I felt. An old man at the top of a hard stair, looking down at the body that had cast my people out. We took our seats. There were 9 of us, all that remained of a delegation that had once numbered 40. The Conquered had given us a section of the gallery set apart from the others, marked by a small standard on a pole, and the standard bore the sigil they had assigned to humanity after the severance. Not the sigil we had carried in, but one of their own devising, a stylized broken thing meant to mark us as a settled question, a war concluded, a people whose own emblem had been struck from the register and replaced. Myra looked at that standard for a long moment and then looked away, and I put my hand on her arm briefly, because there was nothing to say that would not make it worse. Below us the chamber filled. They came in by the processional lanes, the ones we had been rooted away from, and they came in glory. The Osark Dominion arrived first, as protocol demanded, for they held the senior claim. The Osark are a tall people, taller than any human, with gray skin drawn tight over heavy bone, and high-ridged crania that flush with color when their blood runs hot, deepening from gray toward a bruised violet at the edges when they are roused. Their eyes are deep-set and dark and do not blink as ours do. They wear instead a slow nictitating film that passes sideways across the eye, so that an Osark in conversation seems always to be considering, always to be withholding judgment, even when the judgment was made long ago. They came in their war robes, layered gray and black, hung with the cords of rank, and the High Arbiter Sunkale walked at their head with the slow, heavy tread of a creature that has never in its life been told to hurry. I knew Sunkale. I had known him when he was a younger Osark and I was a younger man, and we had sat across a negotiating table from one another in the last days before the severance, when the war was being lost in the only way wars are truly lost, which is in the rooms where the talking happens. He had been an arbiter then, not High Arbiter, and he had told me, in the dry resonant tone the Osark use when they wish to be understood by lesser species, that humanity's error had been to believe it had a place at the table at all. We were an upstart species, he said, a recent thing, loud and quick-breathing, and given to a sentiment they called feeling, which they regarded the way a surgeon regards an infection. We had built ships and we had crewed them and we had fought, and that was admirable in the way the thrashing of a netted animal is admirable, but we had mistaken our thrashing for strength, and strength, the Arbiter said, was not the capacity to struggle. Strength was the capacity to decide, and the deciding was theirs. I had said nothing to that 15 years ago. I had been young, and I had wanted to say a great many things, and my superior, the ambassador I served under, had taught me the one lesson that mattered, which was that the worst thing you can do across a table from a creature that despises you is to confirm its contempt by speaking. So I said nothing, and the Arbiter took my silence for the silence of the beaten, and went away satisfied. He had been wrong about what my silence meant. I want that on the record here at the start, before I tell you anything else. He had been wrong, and he had built 15 years of policy on being wrong, and so had everyone in that bright and beautiful room. But that is the end of the story, and I have only begun it. The Vale Combine came in after the Osark, as the junior claim, and where the Osark were tall and slow, the Vale were small and quick. They are a mottled people, their skin a shifting pattern of brown and ochre and pale gray, jointed in more places than a human is jointed, so that they seem to fold and unfold as they move, never quite still. They do not speak as we speak. Their words come partly from the throat and partly from a rapid clicking of the joints of their long fingers. And the great soft sac at the base of their throat shifts color as they talk, flushing toward red when they are pleased and toward a sick pale yellow when they are afraid. They are merchants, the Vale, traders and brokers and holders of contracts, and they had come into the war late and on the winning side, as merchants do, and they had been rewarded with a junior claim to the spoils, as merchants are. The factor Resethvol led them, a small Vale in robes so layered and embroidered that the creature seemed nearly buried in its own wealth, and the throat sac above the collar of those robes was flushed the deep contented red of a merchant on the morning a long account comes due. I did not know Reseth Vol. The Veil had not been important enough to send anyone of rank to the talks before the severance. They had still been deciding which way to jump. But I knew the type, the way you know the type of a thing without knowing the thing itself, and I watched the factor take its place across the floor from the high arbiter, and I saw the careful distance the two blocks kept from one another, and I understood a great deal about the 15 years I had spent in the dark from that distance alone. Because they were not friends, the Osark and the Veil. They were partners in a division, which is a different thing and a worse one. They had won the war together, or so the registers said, and they had agreed to divide the spoils together, and for 15 years they had been dividing those spoils, and the dividing had not gone smoothly. You could read it in the way the two delegations would not look at one another. You could read it in the cords of mourning that hung among the Osark war robes, more cords than a body should wear for a war that had ended 15 years before, and in the gaps in the Veil delegation, the empty places at their tier where Veil of rank should have sat and did not. They had been fighting. Not the war we remembered, the war against us, that war the registers called concluded. They had been fighting each other. I did not understand the full shape of it yet. I want to be honest with you about what I knew and when I knew it, because the temptation, in telling a story like this, is to make yourself wiser than you were, to pretend you saw the whole of it from the gallery. I did not. I saw the cords and the gaps and the cold distance, and I knew there had been trouble between the partners, and I felt, somewhere under my ribs, the first faint stirring of a thing I had not let myself feel in 15 years, which was hope. But I did not yet know the shape of what was coming. Only Benedek knew that, and Benedek sat beside me with his hands folded around his slim case and said nothing at all. The chamber filled, and the great doors closed, and the proceedings began. A conquered herald rose, one of the small neutral species the body kept for ceremonial work, and read the convening of the conclave in the formal tongue, the long rolling cadences that meant nothing and took a long time to mean it. The purpose of the conclave was stated: the ratification of the partition accord, by which the contested holdings of the Anvil Reach, formerly of the human dominion, now lawfully forfeit by the judgment of the conquered and the conclusion of the late war, would be divided in final and binding allocation between the senior claimant, the Osark Dominion, and the junior claimant, the Veil Combine, according to the schedule appended. The schedule was long. The herald read it. I will not repeat it to you, because I have spent 15 years trying to forget the names that were in it, the names of the great yards of the Reach, the keel yards where my people had built the ships that carried us out among the stars, read aloud in the formal tongue as forfeit property to be allocated like cargo in a hold. The Anvil Reach. I should tell you what it was, so that you understand what they thought they were dividing. The Reach was a belt of rock and ice and old dead worlds wrapped around a dim red star, far out toward the edge of the contested space, and it was, when humanity held it, the greatest shipyard in the arm of the galaxy that any of us knew. We had built it over generations. We had hollowed the asteroids and strung the great construction frames between them, and lit the forges that ran day and night, year upon year, turning the rock of the Reach into hulls and the ice into water and air and fuel, so that a ship could be conceived at one end of the belt and sail out the other end finished and crewed and ready for the dark. The keel yards at the heart of the Reach were the oldest and the greatest of them, the place where the largest hulls were laid down, and the Reach as a whole was the engine of everything we were. A people are their capacity to make. The Reach was our capacity to make. When the conquered spoke of humanity's strength, when the arbiter Sunkale spoke across a table of our thrashing, they were speaking, whether they knew it or not, of the Reach, because everything we threw at them in that war came out of the forges of the Anvil Reach. And the registers of the conquered said that the Reach had fallen, that at the conclusion of the war, with humanity broken and cast out, the victorious blocs had taken the Reach intact, the yards and the forges and the great construction frames and the hulls upon the slips, and that all of it now lay forfeit to be divided. The Osark claimed the senior share, the heart of the belt, the keel yards themselves. The Vale claimed the junior share, the outer yards, the fuel works and the ice harvests. And the partition accord, read aloud that morning under the bright dome, was the final binding division of that captured engine between the two creatures that had taken it. That was the story the conquered told. It was in the registers. It was in the writ that summoned us. It was in the schedule the herald read. It was, every word of it, a lie, and I sat in the gallery and listened to the lie read aloud in the formal tongue, and I felt the old grief and the new hope war in me. And beside me Benedek held his case and said nothing and waited. When the herald had finished the schedule, the high arbiter Sunkale rose to speak for the senior claim. He had aged. I marked it from the gallery, the way the great ridged crown of his cranium had paled toward a uniform gray, the color the Osark go when the fire is leaving them, and the slowness in him that was more than the slowness of his kind. But the voice was the same, the deep dry resonance that filled the chamber without any apparent effort, the voice of a creature that has never doubted it would be heard. He spoke of the long labor of victory. He spoke of the burden the Dominion had carried, the cost of bringing a violent and disordered species to heel, the ships lost and the warriors mourned. And here he touched, with one long gray hand, the cords of mourning at his breast, and I saw the throat sacks of the veil across the floor shift toward yellow, and I marked that too. He spoke of the 15 years since the severance, the long work of pacification, the holding of the Reach against the disorder that follows every great war. He did not say against whom the Reach had been held. He did not have to. The veil across the floor had gone the pale, sick yellow of a people hearing themselves accused without being named, and the distance between the two delegations seemed to widen with every word, though neither moved. I began to understand then, sitting in the gallery, listening to the high arbiter mourn his dead. I began to understand the shape of the 15 years. They had not held the Reach in peace. The registers said the Reach had fallen intact and the two blocs had divided it, but a thing that is divided between two powers that despise one another is not a thing held in peace. It is a thing fought over. The Osark had taken the keel yards and the Vale had taken the outer works, and for 15 years each had eyed the other's share, and each had suspected the other of hoarding, of skimming, of taking more than the accord allowed. And the suspicion had grown into raids and the raids into reprisals and the reprisals into a long, grinding, undeclared war between the partners, fought in the dark spaces of the Reach, ship against ship, over the spoils of a third people they had agreed to dispossess. The cords of mourning the arbiter touched were not for the war against us. They were for the war the two of them had fought against each other, over us, in the belief that the Reach was full of something worth dying for. And the conclave that morning, the ratification of the partition accord, was the peace. That was what I had not understood when the writ came. The accord was not a formality marking an old victory. It was a treaty ending a new war, the war between the partners. A settlement drawn up to finally fix the division of the Reach so that the killing between Osark and Vale would stop. They had summoned us to witness it because the protocol required the dispossessed to witness, and because, I think, they wanted us there, the broken third party, the settled question, as a kind of proof to themselves that the thing they had fought over for 15 years had been real, had been worth it, had been a true prize and not a phantom. They wanted us in the gallery so that they could look up and see the people they had beaten, and believe that the beating had meant something. I understood all of this in the gallery, listening to the arbiter, and the understanding sat in me cold and clear. And I knew, with a certainty I had not felt in 15 years, that Benedek's case was about to come open. Because here is the thing they did not know. Here is the center I have been walking you around. The Reach was empty. It had been empty for 15 years. It had been empty before the severance, before the vote that cast us out, before the herald in this very chamber read the judgment that declared us forfeit. In the last year of the war, when the talking had failed and the deciding, as the arbiter would have it, had gone against us, The people who ran the Anvil Reach had made a decision of their own. They had looked at the war and seen how it would end. They had understood, as the Arbiter never understood, that strength is not the capacity to struggle, and it is not the capacity to decide in a chamber, but something else, something the Ozark and the Veil did not have a word for, and I am not sure my own people had a word for until that year. And they had begun, quietly in the dark, without a word to the conquered or to anyone, to take the Reach apart. Not destroy it. That is what the conquered would have done in our place. That is what the Ozark would have done, scorched the yards and left the partners' ash to divide. We did not destroy the Reach. We moved it. Hull by hull and frame by frame and forge by forge. Over the last long year of the war, the people of the Reach unmade their great engine and carried it out into the dark, into the long spaces beyond the contested belt where the conquered's eyes did not reach, and they took it somewhere the registers had no name for. And there, while the conquered voted us forfeit and the blocs prepared to divide our spoils, they began to build it again. And they left behind in the Reach a corpse dressed as a living thing. They left the great frames standing empty and lit, so that from a distance they would read as working yards. They left hulls upon the slips, but the hulls were dead, stripped, decoy shells with nothing inside them. They left the fuel works running on automated cycles that would keep them warm and humming for years with no one tending them. They left in the data cores of the Reach registries, false registries, beautiful and detailed and entirely fictional, recording a great captured fleet held in the yards, ships by the 100, tonnage beyond counting, all of it waiting in the Reach for whoever should come to take it. They salted the Reach. They left a treasure map with no treasure, and an X drawn large over an empty hole, and then they went out into the dark and they waited to see who would come digging. The conquered came digging. The Ozark came and found the registries in the data cores and read them and believed them, because the registries said exactly what an arrogant victor expects a defeated people to have left behind, wealth too great to carry off, abandoned in flight. The Veil came and read the same registries and believed them for the same reason. And each block looked at the great fleet the registries promised, the hundreds of ships, the tonnage beyond counting, and each block wanted it, and each block suspected the other of getting to it first, of having found the ships and hidden them, of hoarding the great captured human fleet that the registries swore was somewhere in the Reach. And so they fought. For 15 years they fought each other across the empty yards, ship against ship, each side certain the other was sitting on the treasure, neither side ever finding it, because there was nothing to find, because the treasure had sailed out into the dark before either of them arrived, and the only thing real in the whole of the Anvil Reach was the killing they did to one another over a ledger of lies. That is what Benedek carried in his slim case in the gallery of the sundered hall, while the High Arbiter mourned his dead. He carried the true registry, the real accounting of the Reach, ship by ship, frame by frame, forge by forge, the record of what had been moved and when and to where it could no longer be followed, and beside it, the false registry the conquered had found and believed, so that the two could be laid side by side and read against one another. He carried the proof that the Reach had been empty before the vote, that the war the conquered called won had been won over nothing, that the spoils the accord divided that morning did not exist and never had, and that the 15 years of Ozark dead and Veil dead, the cords of mourning and the empty places at the tiers, had all been spent fighting over a hole in the ground. The Arbiter finished his speech. He spoke the closing cadences of the senior claim, the formal acceptance of the keel yards into the dominion of the Ozark, and he sat slowly, with the heaviness of his years, and the chamber was quiet under the bright dome. Then the factor Resathvol rose to speak for the junior claim, and the Veil voice filled the chamber, the strange doubled sound of throat and joint click, and the burden of 15 years was in it too. The factor spoke of partnership, of the long alliance between Dominion and Combine, of the shared labor and the shared sacrifice. And at the word sacrifice the cranial ridges of the Ozark across the floor deepened toward violet, and I understood that the veil was making, under the cover of ceremony, the same accusation the arbiter had made, that the partner had taken more than its share, had hoarded, had skimmed, had cost the Combine its dead. The two speeches were not speeches of victory. They were the closing arguments of a grievance, dressed in the formal tongue, two thieves who had fallen out over a haul and come at last, exhausted, to a settlement, each blaming the other for the blood. And neither of them knew that the hall was empty. The factor finished. The chamber was quiet again, and the conquered herald rose and turned, for the first time since the proceedings began, toward the gallery, toward us. It was in the protocol. I have told you the conquered had a clause for everything, and there was a clause for this, the part of the ratification where the dispossessed party, having been made to witness the division of its property, was offered the ceremonial session, the chance to step down to the floor and place its mark upon the accord, formally relinquishing its claim, so that the division might be not merely imposed but accepted, so that the victors might have, in addition to the spoils, the small clean pleasure of the loser's signature. It meant nothing in law. The accord bound us whether we signed or not. But the conquered loved its forms, and the form required that we be offered the pen, and that one of us walk down from the gallery into the light and place our mark and bow and withdraw. The herald spoke the formula. The human delegation was invited to make the ceremonial cession of its claim to the holdings of the Anvil Reach. A clerk was already moving, carrying the great bound copy of the accord to a small table set on the marble floor in the center of the chamber, directly beneath the highest shaft of daylight from the dome, where the whole assembly could see, and laying it open, and setting beside it the pen. I rose. I want to tell you what it was like to rise from that hard seat and feel the whole of the sundered hall turn toward me, every tier, every species, the Osark with their slow nictitating eyes, and the Veil with their shifting throat sacs, and all the lesser members of the conquered in their bands of color, all of them turning to watch the old human come down from the gallery to sign away the last of his people's claim. There is a weight to that many eyes. The conquered had built the room to make that weight fall on you, the bright shaft of light in the center, the tiers rising on every side, the whole architecture of it designed so that a single figure on the floor would feel the full mass of the body pressing down. I felt it. I am not ashamed to tell you that I felt it, that my old knees did not want to carry me down the stair, that some part of me, the part that had spent 15 years learning to be small, wanted to sign the thing quickly and bow and withdraw, and let the great machine close over us for good. But Benedek stood when I stood, and he put the slim case into my hands, and he said the only words he said in the whole of that morning. He said, "It's all in there. Let them read it." And I went down. I went down the long stair from the gallery and across the marble floor into the shaft of daylight that fell from the dome, and the warmth of that light was on my face and my shoulders, real sun warmth pouring down through the glass, and through the glass, far above, I could see the pale sky of Tessavain and a few high thin clouds and nothing else. No fleet. I want you to know there was no fleet in the sky. The conquered expected, I think, if it expected anything, that a defeated people might make some show at the end, some last gesture of pride, and they had eyes on the sky beyond the dome that morning watching for it. There was nothing for them to see. The ships of my people were out in the dark where the registers had no name for them, and they did not come, and they did not need to come, because the war they would have fought was already over and had been over for 15 years, decided in the year the Reach was emptied, and all that remained was for the conquered to be told. I reached the table. The clerk stepped back. The accord lay open under the light, the great bound pages, the schedule of the keel yards, the place at the bottom where the pen waited for my mark. I did not take the pen. I opened Benedek's case. Inside it lay a single data slate, old human work, the kind of thing the conquered regarded as primitive, and beside it a thin folio of printed sheets, because Benedek had never trusted that a thing read only on a screen would be believed, and had insisted in his careful old way on paper. I took out the slate and I took out the folio, and I closed the case, and I laid the slate and the folio down on the open accord, over the schedule, over the place where my mark should have gone. The herald made a sound. There was no clause for this. I had stepped outside the protocol, and the protocol was the only thing the conquered truly understood, and for a moment the whole great body did not know what to do. I straightened. I felt the light on me. I looked up across the floor to where the High Arbiter Sunkale sat in his pale gray age, the creature who had told me 15 years ago that my silence was the silence of the beaten, and I held his deep, dark, unblinking eyes for as long as it takes to draw one breath, and I said the only thing I said in the whole of that morning. I said, "Count it again." Then I turned and I walked back across the marble, out of the light, toward the stair, and I left the slate and the folio lying on the accord under the eyes of the whole conquered, and I did not look back. It is a strange thing to walk away from the most powerful body in the known arm of the galaxy and turn your back on it. The protocol creature in me, the diplomat of 15 years, screamed that it was madness, that you do not turn your back, that you bow and withdraw and keep your face to the floor. But the older thing in me, the thing that had stood quiet across a table from the arbiter long ago and let him mistake the silence, knew that the back was the whole of the message. We do not plead. We do not argue our claim. We do not stay to watch you read. We put the truth on the table and we walk out, and what you do with it is your affair, because it was always going to be your affair, because the truth in that folio had been true for 15 years whether you read it or not. I climbed the stair. It was a long climb, longer than it had been coming down, the way the second half of any hard thing is longer. The chamber behind me was silent, and then it was not silent. I heard, as I climbed, the first sounds of the conquered beginning to read. A clerk had taken up the slate. I learned afterward how it went, from those who watched from the gallery, from Myra who never took her eyes off the floor, and so I can tell you, though my own back was turned. The clerk took up the slate to remove it, to clear the foreign object from the accord, and in clearing it the clerk saw what it was: a registry. The clerk was a conquered functionary, trained to records, and the registry was in a format the conquered knew, because we had built the false one in that format for them to find, and the true one matched it line for line, column for column, so that the two could be read against one another by anyone who knew the form. The clerk saw the keel yards in the columns. The clerk saw the tonnage. And the clerk, being trained to records and not to politics, did the thing a records creature does, which is to check the tonnage against the schedule of the accord, the schedule the herald had read, the great captured fleet of the Reach that the two blocs had come to divide. The numbers did not reconcile. The herald, recovering, called for the object to be removed and the session to proceed. But the clerk had spoken to the underclerks, and the underclerks had taken up the folio, the paper folio Benedek had insisted on, and were passing the sheets among themselves. And the thing about a body like the conquered, a body of records and forms and clauses, is that it cannot stop itself from reading. It is built to read. You may command the herald to proceed and the arbiters to ignore, but the clerks and the underclerks and the recorders, the small functionaries who are the actual machinery of the thing, will read, because reading is what they are for, and once they have read they will check, because checking is what they are for, and once they have checked they will whisper to one another what the checking found, because they are creatures too, and the thing they have found is the most extraordinary thing they have ever read. By the time I reached the top of the stair and turned, the whispering had begun. I could see it moving through the tiers like wind through a field, the heads bending together, the data slates being passed, the holographic displays along the walls beginning to flicker and change as functionaries pulled up the old registries, the false registries from the data cores of the Reach, and set them beside the true one, and saw, anyone who knew the form could see it in a moment, that the false one was false, that the captured fleet was a fiction, that the tonnage the two blocs had spent 15 years and a long war's worth of dead fighting over had never existed. The High Arbiter Sunkale had not moved. He sat where he had sat, the pale gray of his age, his deep eyes fixed on the table where the slate and the folio still lay, and he had not yet read them, because an arbiter does not stoop to read what a clerk can read to him. But he could see the whispering moving through the chamber, and he was old and he was not a fool, whatever else he was, and I think he understood before the words reached him that something had come apart. The factor Resethvol across the floor had its throat sack, the merchant's contented red of the morning, draining now toward the sick pale yellow of a creature that has begun to suspect the account it came to collect was never real. A senior clerk approached the High Arbiter. I could not hear the words from the gallery, but I did not need to. I watched the clerk speak, the slate held out, the figures shown. I watched the arbiter take the slate at last in his long gray hand and bend his great pale head over it, the nictitating film passing once, twice, slowly across his eyes. I watched him read. The Asark do not show emotion as we do. The face does not move, but the cranial ridge does, the great ridged crown of bone that flushes with the blood when the creature is roused, and I watched from the top of the stair across the whole bright chamber, the ridge of the High Arbiter Sunkale go from the pale gray of his age to a deep and spreading violet, the color of an Asark in the grip of something it cannot master, and I knew that he had reached in the columns of the true registry the line that mattered, the date. The date when the reach was emptied, a date in the last year of the war, before the talks failed, before the vote, before the severance, before the morning he sat across a table and told me my silence was the silence of the beaten. The reach had been empty before he ever judged us. The war he had won over a corpse dressed as a treasure. And every cord of mourning at his breast, every Asark ship lost in the long 15-year killing in the dark of the reach, every dead warrior he had risen that morning to honor, had died fighting the veil over nothing at all. He raised his head. He looked across the floor, the long, pale, slow Asark head turning to the factor Resethvol, and the factor, who had been reading its own clerk's slate, raised its small mottled head at the same moment and looked back, and the throat sack was the full sick yellow now, the yellow of terror. But already shifting at the edges toward another color, toward a deep angry crimson, because the veil mind is quick, quicker than the Asark, and the factor had already understood the second half of it, the half that mattered to a merchant. If the reach was empty, then the 15 years of war between the partners had been fought over nothing. And if the war had been fought over nothing, then every Veil ship the Asark had taken in that long killing, every Veil life, every account the Combine had marked against the Dominion's name, was a debt owed in blood for a phantom. And the Asark, reading the same registry, were arriving at the same place from the other side, that every loss they had blamed on the Veil, every reprisal, every dead warrior they mourned, had been spent killing their partner over a treasure that was never in the vault. They had not been fighting us. There had been nothing of ours left in the reach to fight over. For 15 years, believing they were holding and dividing the spoils of a beaten people, the Asark Dominion and the Veil Combine had been fighting and killing one another, and only one another, over a hole in the ground that my people had dug for them and dressed up as gold and left behind on purpose, knowing that two greedy powers who despised each other would do to themselves what we could never have done to them. The chamber came apart. I've used that phrase, that the chamber came apart, and I want to be precise about it, because it did not come apart the way the young ones imagine when I tell the story, with shouting and overturned furniture and creatures leaping the tears. The conquered is too old and too proud for that. It came apart in a way that was worse, a slow, terrible coming apart, the dignity going out of the great body, the way the air goes out of a holed hull, steady and unstoppable and quiet at first. It began with the factor Resethvol rising. The factor rose, the small mottled creature buried in its embroidered wealth, and it turned not to the herald, not to the conquered, but to the High Arbiter directly, across the floor, breaking every form of the proceeding, and it spoke. And though I could not hear the words from the gallery, I did not need to, because the whole posture of the thing was an accusation, the joints clicking fast and hard, the throat sack blazing crimson, a merchant who has discovered that the war it was sold was a war for nothing, that the debt it paid were paid for a fraud, and that the partner across the floor, the senior claimant, the dominion that had taken the keel yards and the heart of the Reach, had been killing Vale for 15 years over a vault both of them now knew was empty. And the High Arbiter rose to answer, the slow great violet-crowned head lifting, and answered the accusation with an accusation, because what else can a creature do in that moment but turn its rage on the only other creature in the room that shares its shame? And the two of them stood across the bright marble floor under the pouring daylight and made against each other, in open conclave, before the whole assembled conquered, the charge that each had spent 15 years secretly making in the dark, that the other had hoarded, had skimmed, had costed its dead, except that now the charge had a new and unbearable edge to it, because now each of them knew there had been nothing to hoard, and so the only thing left to blame the other for was the killing itself, the long, pointless killing, the war that the truth in Benedict's folio had just revealed to be a war of two thieves cutting each other's throats over an empty purse. And around them, through the tears, the rest of the conquered was beginning to understand what it had been part of, because it was not only the two blocs that had believed the lie. The whole conquered had believed it. The whole body had voted us forfeit, had judged us beaten, had built 15 years of policy and law, and pride on the certainty that humanity had been conquered and its great engine taken, and the engine had been gone before the gavel fell. The judgment had been passed on a phantom. The most powerful body in the arm of the galaxy had cast out a people, divided their spoils, mourned its dead, drawn its maps, written its registers, and the whole of it had rested on a lie that a few thousand human shipwrights had built in the dark of the Reach in the last year of a losing war, knowing their enemies well enough to know that greed and contempt would do the rest. I watched the High Arbiter Sunkale, in the middle of it in the rising noise of the chamber, the accusations crossing the floor, the tears beginning to break their ranks. I watched the old Osark turn, once, away from the factor, away from the quarrel, and lift his great violet-crowned head and look up, across the whole chamber to the gallery, to where I stood at the top of the stair. He found me. Across all that distance, in all that noise, the deep, dark, unblinking eyes found me. The human he had told 15 years ago that strength was the capacity to decide, and that the deciding was theirs. And we looked at one another for a moment, the old Osark and the old man, across the bright ruined chamber, and I will not pretend I know what passed in that alien mind. I have warned you already against the temptation to be wiser than I was. But I will tell you what I think I saw, because it is the thing I have carried for the rest of my life. I think I saw him understand in that one look what my silence had been all those years ago, not the silence of the beaten. The silence of a people that had already decided, and had decided not to tell him, and had let him spend 15 years and a great many of his own dead, learning the shape of the decision the hard way, in the dark, against his own partner, over the corpse of a treasure we had carried off before he ever arrived. I did not nod. I did not smile. The Bible of my own conscience, if I may call it that, the discipline of 15 years, held me still. I only held his eyes for that one breath, the way I had held them across the table long ago, and then I turned, the way I had turned at the table below, and I gathered my people from the gallery with a look, and we went out the way we had come, by the back, through the service galleries and the cold gray corridors built for machines, while behind us the sundered hall filled with the noise of a body discovering that its whole long certainty had been built on a hole. We did not run. I want that understood as well. There was a part of the delegation, the younger part, Myra among them, that wanted to move quickly, that felt the danger of it, 9 humans in the corridors of a body that had just been shown the most humiliating thing it had ever been shown, and shown it by us. But I would not let us hurry. We walked. We walked the long galleries at the pace of an old man's knees, and the recyclers hummed behind the walls, and the cold light fell on us, and no one came after us, because the Conquered had nothing left to spend on 9 humans walking out a service corridor. The Conquered was busy. The Conquered was, behind us, in the bright, beautiful chamber under the pouring daylight, beginning the long, terrible work of understanding what it had done to itself. Our shuttle was where we had left it. We boarded it and we lifted from the gray moon of Tessavane, up through the thin atmosphere into the dark. And as we climbed, I looked back once on the screen, at the sundered hall dwindling below, the great dome catching the pale sun, and I thought of the slate and the folio still lying on the open accord under the highest shaft of light, the truth we had carried in and set down and walked away from, and I thought that there are 2 kinds of strength in the galaxy. There is the kind the Arbiter believed in, the capacity to decide, the gavel and the vote and the schedule read aloud in the formal tongue. And there is the other kind, the kind we had learned in the last year of a losing war, the kind that is the capacity to wait, to be thought beaten, to let a proud enemy mistake your silence for surrender and your patience for defeat, and to carry your real strength out into the dark where it cannot be seen, and to build it again, and to wait for the proud to destroy themselves on the empty place where they think it still lies. We went out into the dark, the 9 of us in the old shuttle, toward the place the registers had no name for, where the reach had been rebuilt, where the forges of my people were lit again, and the great frames were strung again between worlds the Conquered had never found, and where the fleet that the Conquered had spent 15 years fighting over the ghost of rode at anchor in the dark, finished and crewed and ready, larger now than it had ever been at the Anvil Reach, larger than the Dominion's fleet and the Combines together. A thing the Conquered did not know existed and would not learn of until we chose to tell them, in our own time, in our own way, in a chamber of our own choosing. But that is another story, and I am old, and I have told you the one I came to tell. They summoned us to watch. That is where I began, and that is where I will end, because it is the heart of it. They summoned us to watch them divide the spoils of a war they believed they had won, and we came, and we watched, and we put on the table the one thing the most powerful body in the galaxy could not refuse to read, which was the truth, and then we walked out into the daylight and left them to it. There were no spoils. There had never been any spoils. There was only a hole in the dark that 2 proud powers had spent 15 years and a long account of their own dead falling into, and a people they had thought beaten, standing quiet at the edge of it, who had dug the hole and dressed it up as gold and known their enemies well enough to know what they would do. The Arbiter was right about one thing in the end. Strength is the capacity to decide. He was only wrong about who had decided, and when, and that the deciding had been done in silence by a people he never troubled to understand in the last dark year before he ever raised his gavel over us at all. Count it again, I told him. They are counting still.